Okay. Yes, welcome everybody. Justin Virly here again with the Australian Economics Olympiad with our fourth educative seminar a week before the first round test coming up on the 1st of June, next Saturday. Very exciting today. Our guest is old friend Alex Symonds. Alex is a public education economist and economics teacher at the Reserve Bank of Australia. He works in the bank's public education and access team, collaborating with the RBA economists to produce materials to help Australia's economics teachers and students. Prior to joining the bank, Alex was a high school teacher and taught senior economics and business studies, as well as a range of junior subjects. As a teacher, Alex created a suite of online economics resources that have been used by teachers and students around the world. Thank you very much, Alex, for joining us. I myself am very excited to be chatting with you again. I am a high school teacher and make excellent use of the RBA resources, of that education page, of the chart pack, the explainers, the economic conditions updates. So thank you very much for helping us out once again.
It's my pleasure, Justin. Thank you so much for having me.
Excellent. Good. Well, we'll get right into it. Usually the format, I suppose, is just a bit of a Q&A. And as Ray mentioned earlier, any students or teachers who are out there, if you are thinking of asking Alex something about whether it's about the RBA, whether it's about economic concepts or the Olympiad specifically, or anything like that, feel free to fire it into the chat, and we'll do our best to get to those questions. First, for me though, can you just sort of describe your current role with the RBA, and specifically, even though we did get a little bit of a summary of that already, what work kind of actually looks like in both big picture, like what the values, what the purpose of your role is in the big picture, job description-y, mission statement type of sense, but the smaller day to day. As you probably know, students will often wonder things like, do you have to do a lot of maths? Do you work a lot with Excel? Do you have a big team? Are you working from home? How many emails do you get? So both big picture and the small, day to day.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really good question because I think you hear about people in different roles, but it's kind of like, yeah, but what do you do? Like when you sit down each day, what does it actually look like? So my role is a public education economist and economics teacher. So as you probably know, the RBA has a very active education program that is aiming to help increase the quality of economics education and the diversity of people studying economics as well, so that we have a lot of resources that we produce that aim to really help teachers and students better engage and understand with economic concepts. Because if you can understand what's going on, you can develop more of an interest in the subject and enthusiasm for the subject, and maybe pursue it in terms of university or a career. If the subject is very difficult and too hard, it's very difficult to get overly excited about it. So I work in a pretty small team. We have recently moved to the bank's new communications function. So things are pretty fluid at the moment. But basically, we have a couple of key roles. One, as I mentioned, we create and distribute resources. The other thing, and we've done that this week, is we hold school talks. And so pre-pandemic, that happened a lot in person. Sort of pandemic and post-pandemic, we're doing a lot of that online, just like this. So we will give two talks mainly, one about introduction to economics, the other about monetary policy and current economic conditions. The other thing we do, which is a big highlight each year, is that we host the teacher immersion event. This is kind of like the premier professional development event for teachers across the country, that they come to the bank for a day. We have lots of talks and discussions and presentations, and help them with economics. And then in terms of our work as well, that we are working with the bank economists to help them with presentations to schools, teachers, other organisations, dealing with queries from teachers and students in terms of specific economic concepts, and also creating sort of videos and other resources focused on economics careers. What can a career in economics give you? Why it would be a good idea to study economics. So it's a very broad role. In terms of the way that I work, it's very different from working as a high school teacher, that we have a mandate across the bank that you spend half your time in the office. So it's a very flexible kind of working environment. And it's sort of funny in terms of not being a trained economist in the sense that the trained economists that I work with, but working with them. So all
Mm.
the stuff that as a high school economics teacher, you'd be really excited about, but it would sort of maybe form a small part of your day. This is all of your day. And everyone is
Mm.
really excited to just drop everything and talk about the NAIRU, or sort of have a big chat about core versus headline inflation. It's a really interesting role, and something that I've been very excited to be a part of.
Excellent. Excellent. That was going to be a follow-up question. Do you get to, is there much direct interaction between the educative team or the education team and the analysts? Is there like, are there conversations back and forth? Are the analysts producing work that the education team is maybe specifically asked for? Or is it more, you're the education team, they're the analysts, they produce the charts, they produce the records, the data, they spit it out to you, and then you adapt it for the classroom or for teachers? Is there more of that back? Is there much of that back and forth, or is it sort
It's
of,
yeah, it's very collaborative,
wow.
and I think that that's really helpful because, say, for example, from my position, I understand the syllabus, I understand what it's like to be in a classroom, but
Mm,
I don't have that really deep kind of economic experience and
mm,
analytical experience that the bank economists do. So that it's a really interesting role. So, for example, every quarter we do the current economic conditions video that, Justin, I know you're familiar with,
mm,
and share with your class. And the way we put it together is we take the quarterly statement on monetary policy, which is a very large document, and we try and distill it to things that we think would be the most important and most relevant. And then we go back to the economics team and we say, let's talk about the script. Are we hitting the right things? Are we expressing this in the correct ways? Are there things that maybe are really important that we sort of haven't focused on enough? And then we use that to develop the script and to put things out.
mm,
Likewise, they might come to us with a query that they've received. Maybe they were doing a school talk and they got a really curly question, and they might come to us and say, well, this is how I would explain it. What would really resonate for students? So I really like that because people are open to the fact that talking to students and teachers is different from talking
mm.
to economists, and that we're able to work together on that.
Hmm. Excellent. Excellent. Fascinating. Yes, I've never been personally or physically to the RBA or to the teacher immersion event or anything. I definitely regret that and don't know why I admitted that. Um, but I definitely do make plans.
Good,
Um,
good.
are you able to sort of describe any of the other roles or jobs that you've had from finishing uni to your current role? Disclose a little bit about what work you did as a teacher, or if there was any other sort of non-teaching, non-RBA type of economics related work that you've done.
But it's sort of like the kind of thing where you look backwards at the jobs you've done and it all kind of makes sense in retrospect, but at the
Mm,
time felt very random. So at high school, I was not planning to do economics. I had not done commerce. In New South Wales, we have commerce as a junior subject. I'd not done
mm,
commerce in 9 and 10. And then the economics teacher in year 11, going into year 11, said, would you consider it? And I did, and I really, really, really loved it. And so then I did economics at university, and I have this very kind of funny memory because in year 12, I remember going to a talk by Ross Gittins at Sydney Uni, and it was at
wow.
one
Yeah.
of those old school lecture theatres. And I really wish I could remember what I asked, but he kind of chewed me out for the question that I asked in front of everyone. And so the first day of uni next year, someone came up to me and said, hey, you were the guy that got chewed out by Ross Gittins at the lecture. And I was like, okay, sort of a way to establish yourself. But I did a BA BCom at uni and majored in economics. And I knew that I always wanted to get into journalism. And so I was fortunate enough, because of my background in sort of studying economics, that I got a job as a reporter at the Financial Review, and started off by covering financial markets, economic developments, went to Canberra to cover federal politics for them. So spent time in the budget lockup, economic releases, traveling around with Kevin Rudd. It was a really incredible experience. And from there went into broadcast journalism, Sky Business, and then ABC News for a bit. And I liked it, but working on TV is different from working in print. And so I sort of went away and traveled and thought about what might be next, and came back. And I started working as a corporate copywriter. So companies would pay this agency to help them write annual reports and research reports and press releases and all that kind of stuff. And it was interesting, but I always had this idea at the back of my mind of like, what about teaching? What about economics teaching? So I knew I still had contacts at my old high school. So I went back and I took 2 economics classes just to kind of try it on. And one went well and one went badly. And I was like, let's do this. So I did my M-Teach in 2014, finished in 2015, and started working at the end of 2015. And so from 2015 to 2022 was working as a teacher, and always taught senior economics and loved it enormously. And I didn't sort of set out to leave and to work at the RBA, but there was this really weird situation where in 2019, I won a Premier's Teaching Scholarship in New South Wales with the RBA to do a 6-week study tour around the world. You submitted your itinerary. And I was going to look at the way technology was used around the world to teach economics. And I lined up school visits in Silicon Valley and conferences in Europe and all sorts of stuff. And my departure date was March 2020. So that unwound very quickly when things really kicked off pandemic-wise. But I kept talking with the bank, and we changed the project around to work on sort of junior school resources rather than travel. And then from there, we just kept talking, and it turned into sort of a trial job that became a permanent job. So it's sort of like, if you look back on it, you're like, oh, well, you're developing all these cool skills. So for example, that I film the current economic conditions video at bank. And so that was only really possible from my work in broadcast, and then creating a YouTube channel and figuring out that sort of stuff. So it's sort of a weird path, and it's not a typical path into the bank either, but it's been really exciting, and only possible, I think, because of the way that I pursued studying economics.
Yeah, that is, yeah, definitely fascinating, and something I can absolutely resonate. It definitely resonates with me. I started with a degree in economics and finance, and I worked for the bank, or the banks, or however you want to frame that, doing very banky type things, a lot of Excel and a lot of PowerPoint. And then there was very similarly, I rang up my old economics teacher. I wanted to give a go, and he said, sure, just come by. You can teach them about supply and demand if you want to tomorrow. And I gave it a go, and I was hooked, and I wanted to travel, and I came out to Australia, and that was kind of it. You've sort of already sort of danced around it, but can you sort of, teaching and education has obviously like stuck with you. So what is it about, I guess, teaching, and even if you're not directly in the classroom now, your main focus is education, our high school students and teachers. So what is it about teaching economics to high school students as opposed to university or the general public, which is what you would have done, back when you were writing as a journalist or as part of the media publications?
It's a very good question. I think at one level that I feel 16 in some ways, in terms of my interests and the music I listen to and the shoes I like to look at. And I don't know, just like kind of some of my sort of behaviors about things. And so working with teenagers in classroom environment was really fun for me. And I really like maintaining that connection. And I also think that economics is so important, and that it's also not really linked to something that you just accidentally study. So that you have a situation where maybe students, sort of studying economics, they have a good teacher in a good situation, but it's still really complex, and that they need a little bit of assistance. Or that you have a teacher that maybe didn't do economics, but has been put on an economics class, is really keen to do well, but
mm,
it's actually really hard to
mm,
figure it out. And then to figure it out to teach high school students. And then I think also for me, it's sort of like if you look online, which everyone would, and try and find information, not all of it is targeted to high school students.
mm,
So I think that being able to have a good experience with a subject can make or break things
mm,
in a lot of ways. Like if you have a terrible experience studying economics at high school, what are the chances you go on to it at
mm,
university? What are the chances you do it? And it's not saying that everyone should pursue a career in economics, but of all the things that people that I know regret the most, one of them is not having done any economics at some point in their
mm,
education, and the way that they feel like they're missing out on an understanding of the way things work.
mm,
So I think being able to have a role in helping teachers and students better understand the subject, to help them better understand concepts, and then to potentially pursue careers or at least be more confident
mm,
in elements of the economy is what motivates me.
mm. What do you think would be the biggest challenge specifically for the students, but whether in terms of understanding the theory or engaging and enjoying the subject, what do you reckon would be one of the more difficult things that students like struggle with, or the hardest things for me, just the sort.
Yeah, I was gonna put it back on you. I
Yeah.
was like, what do you think?
Yeah, for me, I say this to the students, and I tell this to, the teachers I work with as well, that to me, one of the most difficult things, it's a combination of engagement of engagement and understanding the concepts. And you touch on it a little bit, and it's that so few of the resources out there, whether they are websites or YouTube channels or documentaries or books, so few of the economic content out there is specifically made for young people, for them to understand, where there would be, you know, heaps of literary resources that are specifically like there are just books themselves that are meant to engage young people in reading. There's all sorts of science and physics and chem and business type of stuff that is directed specifically to engage young people. Of course, this is probably an oversimplification, but there's a lot of documentaries out there that you watch and you understand two or three of those, and you could use them to produce a pretty good high school level piece of work. But with economics, it's the finance news, it's the financial review, it's RBA statements, it's speeches from Treasury, none of which are written for a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old to find enjoyable
Hmm.
or easy to understand. So for me, it would be that. Just that if a student doesn't understand what the teacher is trying to teach, they almost have nowhere else to turn.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm so sort of thankful for all the work that you and people like you have done and all that sort of stuff. But is there something else other than that, or would you say that's pretty much?
I think that that's such a big part of it, because it's just like if you're trying to, you sort of like, hey, here's this real world subject that connects to everything around you.
Mm,
But when I bring in the real world elements, I have to build you up
mm,
enormously to give you the foundation to read
mm,
the governor's statement after a cash rate decision,
mm,
or that in assigning something in class that I need to break down a news article to help you understand some of the
mm,
components so you can get the meaning behind it. So I agree with you, and I think that there can be this tension between, if we sort of simplify it, is it not then like the whole
yeah.
economics? And it's kind of like, I think it can be sufficient,
Mm,
because if you're always trying to provide the whole picture, how many people are going to pay attention?
mm,
I think the other thing which is really hard with a student context and a parent context is that I, I did chemistry for my HSC. I didn't do biology. I didn't do physics, but I could probably tell you what all those things involve,
mm,
right? Like I didn't do geography for my
yeah.
HSC, but I can tell you what that is about. If I'm at a subject selection night and a parent comes up and says, should my student do sort of studies of religion or whatever it is, you can be like, well, this is what the subject's about. But they come up to you and they say, what's economics about?
Mm.
And you're like, okay, well, let's figure out what the right explanation here is, because we've done some research about it at the bank, and it's even splits down gender lines. Like the
Mm.
boys are more interested, think about economics more in terms of finance, shares, making
Mm.
money, and the girls think about it in terms of sustainability, making good choices, the environment.
Mm.
And it's kind of like all of those things and even more. So it's tricky, I think, to accurately convey to a student what the subject is really about and why that's important, because it's a bit more abstract compared to what they've done previously.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. It is. It's always difficult, and whether it's subject selection evenings or parent teacher interviews or just the first week of school with in a first year 8 or year 9 or year 10 economics class, you know, we start looking at the circular flow of income or something like that, whatever the first core concept is. And wait, that diagram with all those arrows, that's how important is that? It's a cartoon. And we say, no, that's actually one of the most important concepts. We'll be talking about this thing for the next 2 or 3 years. When we watch the treasurer speak or the RBA governor speak, they'll mention aggregate demand. They'll mention supply and demand. They'll talk about injections, and it's all kind of relevant. I'm often reminded about the difficulty in finding more traditional, engaging material for students when we're a little bit drained as teachers and we're looking for videos to show, which is not something I do very often, but every now and then we're looking for, is there a movie? Is there a thing? And we're like, oh, it's quite hard to find student friendly, economics films or movies or documentaries. The students will ask for things that are probably inappropriate for their level, um, things like that. Granted, or given how difficult it can be to engage students, or for students to naturally find it interesting and engaging, if the student is, if we're thinking of a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old, and usually, especially with the students who have probably signed up to compete in the economics Olympiad, I'm going to assume that you're do quite well in school, not just in economics, but probably across the board. So all of you who are listening or watching, you probably have pretty good grades, and you probably have some good options. Maybe you're weighing up finance or economics or policy, but you're also thinking about engineering because your math scores are pretty good. And you know, maybe you're thinking about med, maybe you're thinking about journalism or writing. You probably have a lot of options. So with that in mind, what type of what type of 15 or 16-year-old would you say, oh, I think if you like this, if you think this way, if this is who you are, you'd probably be more like economics, you'll feel at home with economics. What type of young person do you think should pursue economics?
Yeah, it's a challenging one. I think that you you need to be inquisitive. And I know a lot of young people are inquisitive. I know my toddler is overly inquisitive, but that I think that you need to be able to sort of see something and be like, well, why is that the case? Like, why is that happening? That to sort of not take things necessarily at face value, but want to understand a little bit more about what's going on. I think that it can be helpful if there's an interest in things like government, in things like big picture decision making, in the way that individual businesses and governments all interact of things. But I think also that if you've got a student that has a part-time job and is wondering about why why they're not being paid the same wage as the price of the dishes that they're serving, I think, or that
Mm.
are they getting the right amount of superannuation? I think those
Mm.
stuff is also like, that's economics as
Mm.
well. That if you've got a year 8 student that's really annoyed that they can't go to the movies and the beach at exactly the same time, like that,
Mm.
economics as well. I think the challenge though is that it's different in every state.
Mm,
That in New South Wales for your HSC, you're writing 2 essays, you're doing 4 short answer questions, you've got 20 multiple choice, you're expected to know economic events over the last 2 decades. Whereas
mm,
in Queensland, you're being given stimulus booklets and responding to more
mm,
hypothetical situations, which I think can be more of an engaging sort of way of
mm,
demonstrating your knowledge. But I think that there is a student that is sort of interested in the world around them, that is asking questions, that is wondering why things function the way they do, is worth giving it a go in
mm.
terms of the subject.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. Um, I will remind the audience that if you do have any more questions, any other questions, feel free to sign them on directly either to me. I do have one question that was given to me previously when we started advertising that we were going to be speaking to you, Alex. So the question is from a teacher, and they were wondering what your thoughts were, and we're talking about exam taking strategies with that lens on. So when we're looking at economic charts and the RBA charts and think of unpacking the economic conditions videos or the latest data in the chart pack, how do you separate, or what advice would you give to students or teachers who are trying to help students to take it a little bit further than just describing, all right, here's the blue line, it went up this much, here's what the blue line means. It's the level of unemployment and everyone who's seeking who doesn't have a job but is actively seeking for work. It went up by 5 percentage points over the last year, and since then it's dropped by 2. Before that, 5 years ago it was this, 3 years ago it was that. Beyond the yes, I can read a line graph. How do they extend or deliver more higher order thinking?
I have such flashbacks to marking student work and writing "so what" next to that stuff, that I think that it's sort of rings so true in terms of what students tend to do, in the sense that, like, I know all these stats. Unemployment is this, like you said, this is where it was, all these things. But I think there are 2 things that I would suggest. One is, historical context. What's the story? Is it sort of like in the bounds of what we would expect, or are we around
Mm,
sort of multi-decade lows
mm,
in terms of unemployment, such as where we sit at the moment? And I think also it's kind of like, if, for example, we're talking about unemployment, and you say, for example, in this hypothetical, that unemployment has gone up, that I think it's trying to connect it to some other things. So if we sort of think about macro and we think, well, if unemployment goes up and less people have a job, we're likely to see components of aggregate demand fall. We're likely to
mm,
see consumption fall. But then also, we're likely to see government spending rise because more people would be unemployment benefits, but
mm,
also less tax revenue. I guess it's sort of thinking about, okay, I've got this unemployment thing, but let's think about what is happening with economic growth, inflation, external stability, those other sort of factors, and then thinking about what are the other stats showing to me, so that you would never get a kind of analysis in isolation. That sounds like a really
mm.
convoluted way of
Yep.
saying something, but let me give you a more concrete example. You'll be able to correct me if this is the right cyclone I'm talking about. Cyclone Yazi and banana crops.
Yeah. Yep.
Right.
Yep. That's it.
So Cyclone Yazi hits, wipes out banana crops in Queensland. Banana prices go through the roof, and all of a sudden, inflation is running hot. And so the inflation is sitting outside the bank's target band. Monetary policy would tell you that if that's happening, the bank would raise the cash rate, and then the effect will be felt right through the economy. But that's at the headline level. If you think about it as a temporary, one-off natural disaster, if the central bank raises rates because banana prices are higher, what happens when banana
Mm.
prices fall?
Yep. Yep.
You have to,
Absolutely.
like, you have to look through some things, but I would add, you also have to connect things.
Yeah.
And it's not like saying that whenever a student gets a stat, they then have to connect it to 40 things.
Mm.
It's just like if you've got the unemployment figure that you're talking about, tell me what's happening with inflation, because we know there's a trade off with unemployment and inflation, short run Phillips curve. But also tell me what's happening with growth.
Yep.
And I'd like to know if it contradicts economic theory as well,
Yep.
right? It doesn't undermine your answer if you say, oh, it's not working as the textbook suggests. I
Mm.
think that's something really interesting to point
Yep. Absolutely. We tend to think like, especially if it's under exam conditions and they might be told, they have 100 words or there's 10 lines of writing. If they've made all of those basic points, but they still have 3 lines of space and they're doing very well with time, they can throw in some sort of either anomaly or a critical point that sort of says, well, it might be this other thing, or there would be one negative impact if the government did this or something like that. Excellent, excellent. Thanks very much. Okay, we have a question from a good colleague of mine. This is Sam from Brisbane Girls Grammar School up here in
Also,
Brisbane in Queensland.
good to see you again too,
Yes.
Sam. Thank you for the question.
Sam is wondering about a specific question and hoping to tap into your expertise. We are discussing the business cycle in class. I wonder where you would position our current economy on the business cycle. Good
It's a
question.
really good question.
Great
Yeah,
question, Sam.
we actually do this as part of our current economic conditions talk from the bank. So I was presenting exactly on this. And when I first got to the bank, I would be picking specific points on the business cycle. And that my colleagues at the bank said, no, it's hard to be that precise on the business
Mm,
cycle. So we just have sort of region,
mm,
upswing, downswing, expansion or a contraction.
mm,
And I think what's really tricky, and Sam, maybe this kind of gets to your point, is that we're seeing things in terms of rising prices, falling unemployment that would sort of tell us that we're on an upswing. But economic growth is pretty subdued because consumption has been very low, has been declining. And I think it goes to that point as well, is that sometimes that the theory doesn't always match up in
mm,
terms of like everything ticking the box to say, hey, it's an upswing, it's a boom, it's a recession, which it is not at the moment,
mm,
obviously. So I think that it's a really good question, and that's something that students could maybe elaborate on in saying that you've got some of these factors that would indicate that we're in an
mm,
upswing. But at the same time, not all the components of aggregate demand are firing, that you can think about consumption is slowing, though investment and government spending have been pretty good. So I think we're sort of, it's more of the sort of hotter position
mm.
on the business cycle because of where inflation is at, but that there are these other factors that would add a bit of complexity to that answer.
Mm. I've started as a teacher, I've started trying to unpack for the students that like it might be an oversimplification to think of like, okay, which point are we, but almost visualizing, tracing out the trajectory of the economy along the economic cycle or the business cycle. So, if we're in a recovery, are we in that upswing right after the trough, meaning we're kind of below, like it's still pretty weak, we're still pretty slow. The economy is definitely growing, but it's not ideal. It might still be insufficient. Or are we in the upswing that is blew right past that sustainable level of economic growth? And that might explain why there are some aspects of the economy that are running really hot, but then some things might be slowing down.
Because I
I had a
think,
question.
oh,
Oh,
sorry.
oh no, I was going to say, I had a question or a comment in class where the students were debating where we were on the economic cycle. And one of them said something that was absolutely brilliant, but I'd never thought about it in that way. And now that's how I try to explain it. And then, and it was basically, sir, isn't the trough good? Because the trough means the downswing is ending. If if we were in a downswing and we never got to the trough, the downswing would just keep going. So the trough means the recovery might be starting because things are, and I go, that's exactly right. But normally, at least the students that I've worked with, they tend to think, oh, it's really bad. We must be at the trough.
Yeah.
Which isn't,
And
which, yeah.
it's hard as well with those graphs, I find, because it's like when do you know that you've hit the trough? Do you know
Yeah,
that you've hit the
exactly.
boom? I mean, yes, it
Exactly.
would be good to know that, as you say, you've hit bottom. There's no more bottom to reach,
Mm,
and now you can start to sort of accelerate, but also that you can think of a situation that normally we want growth, right? We
mm.
want growth. We
Yeah.
want what that's important. But if you've got really high inflation and sort of unemployment very low, that in order for those things to correct, then the economy needs to become a bit cooler,
Mm.
and that
Yep.
has consequences. So
Yep.
I think it's also like I don't know how deep you go in Queensland about the current account deficit and surplus
Mm,
and stuff, but it's sort of like this thing where some students be like, well, deficit, that's bad, right? Budget
mm.
deficit, current account deficit, that's
Yeah.
bad. And it's like, well, budget deficit is not necessarily, like whatever. It's sort of what's being done in the context of what's happening and
Yeah.
why that is the case. And current account deficit isn't really up to anyone
Yep.
in Australia anymore. So it's kind of like it just is the situation. And I think it's tricky like that.
Yep. Absolutely. Yes, that is another sort of go-to sort of query. They think, oh, the budget deficit, the government must be wasting money. If they were responsible with money management, they'd be able to have a massive surplus. And then it's very simple. If year after year the government just had a $7 billion surplus, wouldn't you wonder why? Wouldn't you be asking them to build more roads or
Right. Or
or
you
give?
think about it individually, it's like, that individually, if you take out a loan for an appreciating asset,
Mm,
that you're in deficit, but you've got the asset, right?
yep. Excellent. Excellent. Where would you put, this is another question that has come in. Where would you put stagflation on the business cycle? Where is if the economy, that's a that's a
That's
question
really
that I've
hard.
that's a
Like
question that I've been asked, and I say don't reference the economic cycle. If you're talking about stagflation, go with aggregate demand or aggregate supply or production possibility curve.
I think that's right. But it's sort of
Can you
like,
shed light on that?
it's a good question about the limitations in the model. Like
Mm,
the five sector model has no lending from the financial sector to household.
yes. Yep.
Like
That's a
that,
common. Yep.
right? It's sort of like
Yep.
that seems like a big kind of
Yep.
thing that shows you that these models are used to help us understand the concept and to
Mm,
simplify it. But then you get a question about like that, where
yeah.
does stagflation sit? And you're like, it's an excellent
Yeah.
question because it's an economic event that could happen over the course of the economic cycle, but it's not really represented on a
Yep.
graph like that. So I think what your approach is really good is kind of like that. Think about what you're trying to explain. And then much like the economists that I work with, you go and you've got this whole toolkit
Mm,
of stuff that you can draw on and be like, all right, this is going to relate to the cost benefit analysis. Or here I'm going to have a look at kind of like the trend over time, but I'm going to go for the underlying stuff and take off the one
yeah.
off events to get a better picture. So I think rather than being like, always know the answer to something, it's like, do
Mm,
you have the skills to be able to get there and explain your process?
yeah. Absolutely. And just being able to use the tools, that's a great way to put it, to be able to use the models for what they can be used for, but they don't apply to every possible concept. And that is another, I've countless 14-year-olds will say, sir, doesn't with the circular flow model, but doesn't the bank give money to households sometimes as well? And don't businesses pay taxes? And usually I
Yes,
just say,
don't be.
well, we can't we can't draw arrows everywhere. Like otherwise there would be arrows in every direction and then the model wouldn't make any sense. So yeah, that's a good way of like how is the model, what's the model best used for? All right. We do have a question, one more question from Millie Bloomfield. Thank you, Millie. How would you suggest preparing for the upcoming first round? Yes, this is a very good question. I'm not sure how much how much advice you can give, but there's a very small sample of practice questions available on the website. No previous papers have been given. It's very explicit that the AEO is not pulling from specifically the New South Wales or Victoria or Queensland or WA by design, because they want to make sure no one has an advantage. So with that in mind, over the next week, how would you recommend this student preparing? Thank you, Millie, for keeping us more on task.
Can I ask Ray to just step in and just tell us, can you just state the format of the first round
Yeah, sure.
as a kind of reminder for everyone as well?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I guess for the AEO first round, there are two parts. I think your teacher should have let you know that, because we have the information sheet on our website. Everything about the test is actually available. Nothing under the table, or we don't send like a secret material to any of the teachers participating. So if you haven't, go to our website, aeo.org.au. There's an information sheet there contain a few questions you can have a look at. But the exam contains two parts: multiple choice, 40 multiple choice, and 3+1. So 3 open question and 1 bonus question. So these 3+1 question are extended response. So we are trying to persuade you to limit your word to 300 words per response, but you can extend to 350. But anything over that, we won't consider that, because we need to mark everything within a week, actually 4 or 5 days. So anyway, so like 2 parts: multiple choice question and open questions. For the multiple choice question, they're based on what we are trying to do is curriculum free. So we have students coming from different areas of Australia. We got students study IB as well, so it's an international curriculum. So we can say that it's mainly tests your understanding of economic knowledge without considering too much of what kind of curriculum you're studying. You can even say that it's a quite intuitive testing. So like if you know the economics, if you are used to studying and talking about economics, you should feel fine about the multiple choice question. So this is what we were trying to do, curriculum free. So we recommend the core economics textbook and some of resource on CIEE, but we don't rely on anything to coming up with the question. So that's the multiple choice. For open questions, we recommend you to have a look at Australian recent economic news of Australia. So focus on what happened in Australia, because it's Australian Economics Olympiad. So we encourage students to apply their economic learning. So all the discussion Alex and Justin just had, so they're like, very similar to what we are trying to do at the AEO. So like, whether you can trying to explain things happening in Australia, why these economic policy are coming up, what kind of discussion are behind them. So if you are used to this kind of dialogue in your classroom, or like in some of the assignment, you're trying to give your answer to these type of questions, I think you're all set for the Economics Olympiad. So that's the first round competition. We don't really, again, there's no syllabus, there's no like curriculum you're solely relying on. The good thing is like, so you can just unleash all your inner economist power on the two parts of the exam, and then trying to have fun. I would say, yeah, just maybe you haven't have a look at all the economics, have a review of all the economic knowledge you have learned so far in high school, and then just to check out some of the recent Australian economics news that can be helpful for you to prepare for the economics Olympiad. So yeah, hope I answer your question.
One thing I would add, and thank you, Ray, for that. One thing I would add, and that this goes back to marking all sorts of assignments, is that something that I can find with students is that the explanation sits in their head and it feels really obvious to them. And when you get your marks back, it would be a kind of thing where you'd sit down with your teacher and you'd say, but what I meant to say was this. And so in this exam, you are not going to be able to sit down with anyone afterwards and to try and clarify what you said. So my advice would be, explain your thinking, and more than that, explain the economics behind that. So for example, with what Justin and I were talking about, if you've got a situation where you've got, unemployment is changing and you're sort of providing some context or understanding, talk about the fact that, that there's the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Give some sort of economic background that goes beyond the question, sort of the immediate term of the question, but looks at the elements of the question. And in terms of the multi-choice, that your usual principles, underlining keywords, also, sort of or mentally focusing on the keywords, and then eliminating options and going with the most likely. But I just think that I experienced so many times that when students would talk to me after an exam, they would very articulately and coherently talk about what they meant, but that luxury doesn't exist in external exams. So that when you are explaining something, really do explain it.
Yes, excellent. I'll chuck in something with the multiple choice as well. Yes, and Alex, you touched on it a little bit that, the process of elimination, keywords, working out the most likely. I've often found students, of course, there might be situations where A and B both seem like they can be correct. A can be correct and sometimes B can be correct and sometimes, or there's three possible which one. And usually teachers will say, well, just go which one is the most correct. And the students will like, which one is that doesn't mean anything really, which one is the most correct. The way that I try to explain which one is the most correct is, and I think it works well with economics, is whichever, if there's an answer that you would say is right most of the time, where the other possible options could be right if you make a certain set of assumptions, then the need to make those assumptions probably makes it less right than the option that is right most of the time. So if option C is, yes, that is a very, very likely impact of contractionary monetary policy, and that's option C. Option C feels really strong, but B is sort of distracting you because you think, well, B could be right as well if we have currently really low inflation. Ironically, like B could be correct under a certain circumstance. If C is generally correct and B could be correct, but you have to add context to the question for it to be suitable, then my advice would be don't go with that one. Go with the one that is correct, ceteris paribus, if without having to add any new information or everything else is equal, which one is correct most of the time. Does that seem fair, Alex?
Very much so. And Millie, thank you for the question. I think it's worth saying that for those of you doing the Olympiad, that it's a really impressive thing to dedicate your time towards, and that I think it's something that you can also point to as you go forward in terms of your commitment and interest to economics, that this wasn't just the kind of thing that has come along recently, but this has been a long-standing thing that you have pursued.
Yes. Excellent. I apologize to the other question askers in the chat. We are running a little bit tight on time, so we might have to call it after just one more fun question that I like to ask all of our guests. So I apologize to the students and teachers who have been forwarding some great questions. For our closing question, Alex, can you think of any one economic issue in Australia you feel would be the most important to address, whether it's the biggest or the worst problem, or perhaps it's something that you just feel we should be looking at this more and not, there doesn't seem to be much mainstream attention. So not necessarily this is the worst economic issue in Australia, but it could be that. Is there anything, one economic issue you feel like, okay, if I could choose what we were going to look at and focus on, I think this would be worth a bit more attention and eyeballs on it.
I think it's an excellent question. And I would firstly say that I'm definitely talking about this in my personal capacity and not as any kind of representative of the Reserve Bank. And I think I've got two answers. And I think one that's very topical and affects everyone is in terms of housing, in terms of affordability and access. This is not just purchasing housing, but also the cost of rents and where you live, because I think that it flows on to affecting lots of people's choices in terms of things like where they settle, where they work, do they start a family, what's their kind of life like. So I think that is an issue that has a lot of focus on it, but I just think it is really important because so many things stem from being able to secure housing in the locations and for the price that you require. And then I think that the bigger one, which has sort of become very important to me in being a father is childcare. And I think it's in terms of the incentives that might exist to work in a field like childcare, but also like education, teaching, all those sorts of things, that ensuring that you're not just relying on people who grow up wanting to change the world or help people, that there are also really benefits and incentives and structures that help people to stay and continue to work in really important fields like those areas. I think that working out how the systems can sort of retain and sort of have the best, and that it's spread across all sectors and all systems, I think those are really important issues.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Alex. Wonderful, wonderful. I couldn't agree with you more. I have a young child as well, and yes, the whether it's the providing childcare or the general intensity of school and the quality of his education and safety and well-being, and as he steps into that world and all of that sort of stuff is definitely an important thing. I wish I often think like we're in a space now where, of course, the vast majority of teachers, if not every teacher, is doing that job because they absolutely love it. I do tend to think it's a little bit facetious, but I do tend to think it'd be nice if there were some who were doing it for the money. I wouldn't mind if down the track there were a lot of teachers who said, I'm just here because it pays well. And that way, and now class sizes are smaller or schools are better resourced and all of that sort of stuff. Because
we work flexibly and we sort of do more remote stuff or whatever it might be. Yeah.
Yeah. And if that meant someone was helping me out with my marking just for the money,
oof, yeah,
I wouldn't argue against that. Okay. Thanks so much, Alex, for helping us out and for giving up your time on a Saturday. Ray, I'll throw it back to you. Were there any more further announcements or last minute things before next Saturday that you wanted to touch on or remind us all about?
No, I think, like I said, everything, if there anything coming up, we'll send an email to all the teachers participating, sending kids to the first round of competition. Yeah, I'd already sent you a timeline as well, so everybody will know whether they're getting to the second round or not the week after the exam. So everything kind of happening very fast, and hopefully we can see some of these people, some of the participants in the Saturday after next Saturday. So that will be our fifth educative seminar. That one is only reserved for all the students participating or qualify for the second round. We're gonna randomly put you guys 40 qualifier into 8 groups. So you're gonna very excitedly, you're gonna meet a lot of students coming from different schools, different states. You're gonna working together on an economic policy case study. So yeah, that's gonna be, it's always it's a thrilling experience. It's really a very different a study experience for everyone. So yeah, so all the best for the competition, first round competition next Saturday. Yeah.
Excellent. Wonderful. Okay, everybody. That wraps everything up for our 4th educative seminar. This is the last one, I believe, of the open educative seminars.
Yeah.
There won't be a seminar next week, but a fortnight from now, that seminar will be exclusively open only for the people who finish in the top 40 after this first round 1 test. So that one, everybody, if you're fortunate for you to be on that list, that one will generally be compulsory. It'll be your expectation, so that way you can meet your teammates and all of that sort of stuff. Thanks very much. We look forward to getting the video up on our YouTube channel. And yes, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Thanks, Justin. And
Thank
big
you,
shout
Alex.
out to Justin hosting all the educative seminar this year. That's a huge thing you have done. Yeah, you've done an excellent job. Yeah. Thank you.
Great.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, enjoy the rest of the weekend. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.